Alright, so this morning we are talking about what is man. That is that's our topic for today. Kind of moving through Rudolph's small Christian beliefs book. I don't think I brought mine today. Kind of working our way through there, and we're at the section of what is man. So you see at the top of your handout, I put a couple quotes that I thought were pretty helpful. Again, we always try to have a catechism or confession just to make us sound smarter than we really are. This one is Westminster, question 17. Question is titled, "What is man?" or "How did God create man?" It said, after God had made all the other creatures, He created man, male and female, formed the body of the man of the dust of the ground, and the woman from the rib of the man, endued them with living, reasonable, and immortal souls, made them after His own image, in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, having the law of God written on their hearts, and power to fulfill it, and dominion over the creatures, yet subject to the fall. That's question 17 of the Westminster Confession. And the second quote is from C.S. Lewis. I thought this was interesting. This was Lewis is writing a letter to one of his friends, and he says, "Cease not to make mention of me before our common Lord." That's kind of the end of his letter. And then he kind of just puts in his parentheses, "True God and only true man, for all we others since the fall of Adam are but half men." I thought that was an interesting way to think about what is man in terms of a half man. We're not fully what we were created to be. So just a couple quotes up there. So Genesis 1 is where we're gonna start, and I'm gonna kind of lay out the framework of where exactly we're going. We're gonna look at this from you could approach this in many different ways, but we're gonna look at it in the specific kind of format of a biblical narrative perspective. So we're going to kind of take the key climactic points of the biblical narrative and kind of underneath that flesh out what is man underneath those categories. So we're going to talk about creation. So what is man in creation? The fall. So sin entering the world, what that did to man. Redemption. So how can man be made right with God? And then finally consummation, or how can man that has fallen be brought back into fellowship with God. So again, first we are in Genesis 1 verses 26 and 27. So your first blank right there on your sheet. Obviously you were probably expecting this one, but the first blank is man is created. Man is created. I'll read Genesis 1:26. He said, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Verse 27, so God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. So this is a foundational point of what we believe it means as Christians. We believe it means to be human. We believe that being human means, at a very foundational level, that we were created by God. If you drop down to subpoint A, we're going to put this idea that we were created by God in contrast to the secular worldview, which would say that we're created as a Christian worldview, and then subpoint A, we're not a product of random events and processes. Random is your blank right there. So the foundational question, so when we say, what does it mean to be man? The question we have to ask first is, okay, well, how did we get here? Why are we here? Out of all the galaxies, the furthest galaxies that we could see with a telescope, why is there a planet that we know of that has life that exists as it does, and humans on it that exist as we do? So there's kind of two foundational worldviews. There's the one worldview, again, that says we're created by an intelligent, spaceless, timeless, eternal creator that is not subject to creation, but has dominion over it and created it, therefore owning it. The other perspective would say that we came to be as kind of a random assortment of chances and processes and evolution, and kind of sparked by one originating event, which in some ways they still can't give a definite answer of how that happened, but once that happened, we've kind of just slowly over time, millions and millions of years, we've kind of, by ways of evolution and natural selection, become to be how we are today. So again, that's the two worldviews, the basic two worldviews, and we could spend hours talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the evolutionary idea, but today we're not going to really focus on that, but we need to know that exists, because we're going to talk in a little bit about how Christians believe as being made in the image of God, that gives us certain morality, certain things about being in the image of God that evolutionary processes can't really explain. So evolutionary processes can't really explain morality well. So why do we think the things we call good, why are they good? Evolution has a hard time answering those questions. So we're going to, again, focus on the creation, obviously, because that is the Christian worldview. Again, Genesis 27, I think, is the key passage here. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. So this passage in Genesis, right? So if you're reading a novel, what you're going to find is things that happen in the first few chapters of the novel usually are going to set the trajectory for how you're going to read the rest of the novel, right? In the same way, Genesis 1, and actually 1, 2, and 3, which we'll see in a minute, is going to set the trajectory of how we're going to read the rest of the Bible. So we have to understand the characters that we're talking about in the Bible. This gives us the foundational truth of how they got here and why they're here and all of those questions. So again, we're not a product of random events and processes. That's the kind of two worldviews. So I guess the question we want to answer first is, why is it important that we begin with the doctrine that man was created? Okay, well, there's a couple reasons why this belief is important. One, this belief will explain not only that we were created, but why we are created. Okay, so if we're nothing more than a kind of random process of events, then you can't say there's any kind of overarching, universally applicable purpose for life, right? So this is where the secular worldview is very subjective, meaning what's true for me and how I think I should live my life. If that's good for me, you keep yours to yourself and you do what you want. Now, obviously, that doesn't work out well, because I don't think any of us would say, well, Hitler was fine, he just lived how he wanted to live, it's his life, he can choose how he does it, right? Obviously, that doesn't work when you play the worldview out, but the creation worldview would say that there's purposes why we are created, and we're going to look at those here in a minute. And then secondly, so why we are created in terms of the purpose we're created, but also it explained to us not only why we are created, but how then we should live. Okay, so if we're operating under a worldview that says we're a random process of events, then there is there's no universal supply of knowledge of how we should live, right? There's no kind of key objective truth of what morality is. There's no objective truth of what kind of the right way to go about life is. But if there is a God who is, again, spaceless, timeless, eternal, not a part of creation, but over top of it, if there is a God who exists like that, then he would have the right to define what the right way to live is. So he can give us our purposes, but he can also give us the right way to live. Does that make sense? Again, so that's why it's important that we start out with this creation worldview. So the illustration I thought of here is, so in our kitchen, so I'm sitting at our kitchen table last night, and we've got a print of a Monet painting on our kitchen wall. Okay. So who is it that has the right to say what that Monet painting is about? It would be Monet, right? He's the one that painted it. He designed it, and therefore, because he designed it, he has the authority to tell us what it's about. In the same way, God, as the Creator, has the right to tell us what it is that we are about. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with the foundational worldview that man is created and not a product of random events and processes. If you go down to line item B, I don't know why I call it line item, just line B. It's like we're doing a budget in here or something. Line B. So man is created in God's image. Michael likes to give us foreign language terms, so our foreign language term for today will be from Latin, And it's the Imago Dei, right? We're created in the Imago Dei, the image of God. So what does that mean to be made in the image of God? Well, this kind of shortest, most succinct definition that I could find was the image of God means that we are like God and that we represent God. Okay, so as created beings, as man, as created beings, again, we saw in Genesis 27, there's a distinction between when God creates the rest of creation and when God creates man. There's something special that's happening there. And it's in the image of God. That means there's a special status, special purpose, special reason for why we are created. Another way you can think about being made in the image of God is, this is going to sound like you're breaking all the rules and definitions and you can't use the word in the definition, right? So we're made in the image of God. It just means we are created to image God. So the way that I've kind of thought about this is kind of like a mirror. So if you go into your whatever place where you have a mirror, a bathroom probably, right? What does the mirror do? Right, the mirror exists to display, to reflect the person who it's showing. Right? Well, in the same way, we are in some ways like mirrors, where God creates us so that when other things and people look at us, they see the image of God. They see God in the way that we live. I heard one pastor who said it's almost like we're like a mirror at 45 degrees that God is kind of shooting down to us, and as it hits the mirror, it reflects off to where everyone else can see what God is like. That's the purpose of being made in the image of God. So what does this include? Okay, so it includes the communicable attributes that we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about the attributes of God, and that we display some of the characteristics of God. Now, again, on a very finite and then obviously flawed by the fall, but a very finite way we display some of the characteristics of God. Categories such as morality, so the fact that we're moral beings, that we have a moral compass, that we think some things are right and some things are wrong, and we have this kind of intuitive idea of what is right and wrong, and we can live according to a moral standard that's set up for us. Right? You don't find many lions in Africa kind of stopping before they chase down an antelope and saying, I wonder if it's moral to go attack that really small one, or I wonder if it's moral to go attack the weak one. They just do it. They don't have a moral compass that guides the way they live. It's something that makes us distinct. Other categories such as spirituality, so the fact that it's interesting that even if you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, you have to wrestle with the fact that millions of people for years and years and years have believed in God. There's just something inside us, and Ecclesiastes would tell us that it's the fact that God has put eternity on our hearts, so that we know something is coming later, that this physical world that we live in is not the end all, and this aspect kind of relates and reflects God. Our rationality, the fact that we can make rational decisions, right? So when God creates the world, He speaks, and things come into existence in a well-ordered, well-mannered way, and in the same way we can think through things and make rational decisions and go about life in a rational way. Our internal sense of justice, right? So the fact that we all read about the Holocaust and we say, no, Hitler was evil. Okay? That's just it's something in us that's the image of God that we would want justice. And you can go on and on and on. But again, the basic definition I think that we can operate on is that we are like God and we represent God. And again, I think the mirror is the best illustration, because when I go into my bathroom home and I look into the mirror has infinitely less abilities, and it doesn't have all the same things about me that I do, but it does show a small glimpse of who I am. So that's the image of God, the Imago Dei. If you're in Genesis 1, flip over to Genesis 9, a few pages, Genesis 9. We're going to use this in a minute to talk about the fact that we retain the image of God even after the fall. But I think Genesis 9 is a clear example that being made in the image of God means that life is valuable. And human life, as being created in the image of God, is valuable. Genesis 9, verse 5 and 6. It says, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and for man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So this is post-fall, and as God is making a new covenant with Noah, and in some ways reestablishing some of the same purposes that he gave to Adam and Eve in the original creation, he's reestablishing some of those things. And what he does here is he inserts that taking the life of a human is in this case punishable by death, and in some ways it just shows the seriousness of taking human life. And the reasoning behind that is not just because it's a bad thing to do, but because man is made in the image of God. So there's nothing in here that would tell us that we should die for eating an animal, right? But there's a specific punishment here established for the shedding of man's blood. And it's because that we are made in the image of God. And we tease this out all the way through the Old Testament into the New Testament, and it just remains. You see over and over that human life is valuable. And this is why we fight against injustice. So again, I was thinking so in the mornings on my way to work, I usually listen to Al Mohler's The Briefing, which is very helpful, kind of talking about worldview. And for like 2 weeks straight, it seemed like every morning, the issues we were talking about were abortion. This is right when the Planned Parenthood videos came out, and also marriage, same-sex marriage. And I think if we look back to Genesis 1 again, think about how the two key issues of our day all come from out of a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding of Genesis 1 verse 27. Think about it. God created man in his image, meaning there is worth there. So that's why we believe babies in the womb have worth, because they're created in the image of God. And in the image of God, He created them male and female. He created them, meaning that there's a purpose to being created male and female. This is why it's so important to establish the fact that we were created, because it fleshes itself out in many other ways, and even contemporary cultural ways. It's important that we know this. So we'll keep going down to line C. Line C, man is created with specific characteristics. That should be verse 27, not 26, sorry. So we see here, we're going to kind of briefly go through this, but distinct characteristics being male and female. There are differences to being created male, being created female. We see in Genesis 2, when kind of we zoom in and double click on the creation of man, that God created gender, and it was a good part of creation. So it wasn't as if the fall happened and then God said, well, I guess we got to bring somebody else into the party. No, He created us male and female. We're given specific characteristics. And again, think about that. Even in cultural issues today, such as the transgender rights movement, who would say that gender is a spectrum that you can kind of grid out. You can kind of be male, but kind of be female, and kind of in the middle. The Christian worldview would say, well, no, God created us male and female. He gave us specific characteristics, and that was for our good. So you think about, in a second we're talking about the specific purposes of God, that He created us to procreate, to fill the earth, and to have dominion over the earth. And one of the ways He did that was He created complementary genders that would help aid in those processes. Right? So you need man and woman to be able to procreate, and having a husband and wife in the covenant of marriage would help to rule and cultivate the world. So we're created with specific characteristics, and then line D, man is created with specific purposes. This is where we see verse 28 in Genesis 1, going down, and God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So man in his created state was given two key tasks, two purposes, two reasons for existing. And that was one, to fill the earth with image bearers of God, so that God would receive glory from His image kind of filling the earth, and to rule the earth and have dominion over it. And we could kind of have, a couple of weeks on what it actually means to, rule the earth and subdue it. But the main purpose that we were given was to procreate and to rule and cultivate. So that line is D, was man is created with specific purposes. So flip over to Genesis 3. We're gonna, your second line there, number 2. So man is created. Again, we're walking through the biblical narrative and the key points of the biblical narrative. The first key point was that man is created. Second key point is that man is fallen, or man has sinned. You see this, and we're not going to read Genesis 3, but Genesis 3 kind of gives us the details of how sin first entered the world. Then your line item A there. Despite sin, we still retain the image of God. We retain the image of God. So the introduction of sin into the world does not mean humans lose their image of God. We retain the image of God. Again, in Genesis 9, we see that post-fall, God gives one of the main reasons for punishing people because of taking human life. The reason is because man is created in the image of God. So the way that I found that was kind of helpful to give me some categories for this was, the image of God was not destroyed in the fall, but it was distorted or defaced in the fall. So we don't lose our image of God, but it's distorted. It no longer operates how it should. So we still bear image to God, but we don't do it in the way that we ought to. All right? So that's what our sin does. It calls us to not be able to image God rightly. To go back to our mirror illustration, right? So a mirror, when it's operating functionally, is facing you and it's clear. Well, what sin does is sin takes the mirror and says, God, I'm not going to image you anymore. I would rather flip it and put the emphasis on myself and image myself as God. So you kind of flip your mirror around. So imagine if you go into your bathroom today and you take your mirror off the wall and you turn it around and kind of hang it backwards up against the wall. It doesn't function the way it should because it's not set up the way it is. And that's kind of what sin did for us. Line B. Okay, so this is why. So we're going to go now for the fact that we are sinful. Right? Genesis 3 tells us that we are sinful. We retain the image of God. We're sinful, and therefore, line B, we are sinful because of our shared guilt in Adam. Flip to Romans 5. You got your Bibles. Again, a text that you could spend countless hours talking about. Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. Okay, this is kind of telling us that sin enters the world, and therefore, as the image bearers of God procreate and fill the earth, as they are filling the earth with image bearers of God, they also are filling the earth with naturally sinful people. Right, this is where you can get verses like Psalm 51:5, or in sin did my mother conceive me, I was brought forth in iniquity. You hear phrases like that. So the little babies that we have running around or crawling around our church building right now, right? What the Bible would tell us about them is that in Adam as their representative, the guilt from his first sin continues down the human line and gets to us as well. Now that can be a tough truth to talk about, right? Because the first kind of natural thing we would want to say is, that's not fair. I wouldn't have done it. Well, we're sinful because of our shared guilt now, but then line C, we're also sinful because of our own sinful deeds. Right? To go back again to our shared guilt in Adam, I found a good quote that I thought would be helpful. The great philosopher Thorogood once wrote this. He said, on the day I was born, the nurses gathered all round, and they gazed in wide wonder at the joy they had found. The head nurse spoke up, and she said, leave this one alone. She could tell right now that I was bad to the bone. You guys know the song, Bad to the Bone, right? That's all that is a exposition on our shared guilt and Adam. In birth, we are brought forth in iniquity. Again, I don't know where, that was a nice poem, I guess, from your poem book. where they came from. So we are sinful because of our shared guilt in Adam, and we're also sinful because of our own sinful deeds. You find this in Romans 3. Right? No one is righteous, no, not one. Ephesians 2, 1 and 2. You were dead in the trespass and your sins in which you once walked, meaning you walked in the pattern of sin, following the prince of the power of the air. So, kind of where we're at. We're created to image God, but we're fallen. Right? We're sinful. Then line 3, man can be redeemed. Okay, we're going into the Christmas season. And one of the most glorious truths of the Bible is that our biggest problem is solved by line A, God becoming flesh. God became flesh. John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Also going to give you the more I teach this class, the more I'm trying to sound smarter than I am. But line B, the answer to the problem of sin can be found in the hypostatic union. I was thinking about making you guys feel hypostatic, but I thought that would be too mean.
You have to spell it for us.
Yeah, right. The answer to the problem of sin is in the hypostatic union. What does that mean? Hypostatic union, big term. Really, I put the definition, the easiest definition in parentheses right there. That Jesus was 100% God. He's fully divine. In him the fullness of deity dwells bodily. And he's also 100% man. So that he can be tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin. That he can live a life as a human and be perfectly obedient to God. And this is the answer to our biggest problem for a couple reasons. And this kind of dual nature of Jesus as God and man. One, you see down there in C, line C, subline I. That's why I don't like handouts like this, because I never know how to say it. The requirement or the punishment for sin is that man must die for sin. So what it means to be human is that if we sin, man must die as the punishment for that sin. You see that in Genesis 2:17. So God creates Adam, puts him in the garden, tree of knowledge of good and evil, and he says, "Do not eat of this tree, for if you do, you will surely die." Okay? I was reading a book a while back, and they were kind of wrestling through the question of, well, what do you think Adam thought about when he said, "You will surely die"? And one of the guys said, well, death hadn't entered the world yet, so he probably didn't have a full concept of it. But the way that he thought Adam would have said was, "I don't know what death is, but it's something dreadful, no doubt. I want to stay away from it." And so man must die for sin. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. Man must die for sin. Yet, line below that, only God could take the full wrath of God as the punishment for sin and live. This is why Christ has to be fully God and fully man. You can't say he's 50-50, like he's half God, half man. Right? This isn't like the Greek mythology where a god kind of meets a human and they have a kid, and it's like Hercules, who's like kind of God and not fully God. He's like kind of man, but he's way better than all the other men. No, the Christian believes that God is fully God and fully man. So Christ is the perfect picture of what perfect humanity is. Right? So Jesus, as he lived on earth, lived as the perfect fulfillment of what humans should live like. What Adam was meant to live like forever but couldn't because of sin, Christ fulfilled. And he's also the perfect image of divinity. So again, in him, the fullness of deity dwells bodily. Think about that for a minute. The fullness of deity. Think about all the things that you know about God and how vast and wide and just all the things that encompasses being divine. And in some way, that was bottled up into a human flesh. It's one of the most amazing truths of the Christian gospel is that God wrapped himself in human clothes. It's like, you guys remember, this is so random, I don't know why it's getting in my head. You guys remember Stretch Armstrong? Right? You could stretch his arms out. Well, I remember when I was a kid, right, I would squeeze Stretch Armstrong's arms, and I'm in the car one day and I squeeze it, and it all the goo just comes out. Right? That's what I feel like. It's like Jesus had to almost be exploding with divinity. There's so much just bottled up into one man, and he had to be just that, right? Because any human under the wrath of God would be destroyed and finished and have no hope. Only God could, in his infinite abilities, could sustain the wrath of God and then raise from the grave. But in God's justice, man had to be the one that paid for sin. So how is God fully just in allowing man to be reconciled to him? Well, he's fully just in that because man did die for sin. And it was one man who would die in the place of others. And it was an infinite God who could take the full wrath. And that's, again, talk about mind-blowing things. Your sin and my sin earns the infinite wrath of God. You can't quantify it. It's just the infinite wrath of God. Now take that infinite wrath of God and multiply it by billions and billions of people. That's what God's wrath is owed to humanity. And Jesus, for those who would turn from their sins and believe in him, took the full infinite wrath of God for anyone who would come to him. Again, this is something we'll never understand. Our finite minds can't grasp this truth. So, again, stages of our kind of redemptive history of man. We're created in perfect fellowship with God. We're created to image God, and we fall. We no longer image him as we should. Then we can be redeemed by Christ. So again, to go back to our mirror illustration. Right? We have taken the mirror and flipped it on ourselves. And what happens when we're converted, when we come to know Christ? We see Christ as glorious and we say, no, there's no way I could want to have the mirror pointed at me. I must point it back at you. Now, the problem is, over time, as we have turned our mirror around, it's gotten dirty and distorted. And so as we live our Christian life, the mirror is constantly being cleaned off. So that more and more and more we image, we show the right image of God. Colossians 3:9-10 says this: do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self. And this is the key part. If you're a Christian, this is where you're living at right now. And you will live at until Christ returns. Put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its creator. Again, do not lie to one another, seeing you've put off the old self and its practices, and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. What does this mean? All this means is that as we see more and more of Christ, we see more and more of who he is, we begin to image him better and better and better and better. Right? We're being renewed after the knowledge in the image of his creator. We're more conformed into his image. So that's the goal. You want a really basic definition of how you should live your life now. You should try to live your life now being conformed to the image of Jesus. So you should look at Jesus and you should say, I want to be conformed into that image. That's the simple definition of kind of what sanctification is for us now. So we can be redeemed, but that's not where the story ends. Line 4, man will be redeemed. This is kind of at the end when Christ returns. 1 John 3:2 says this: Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. Again, just an incredible doctrine of the Christian faith. And one day we will be able to see, and we will be with him, and we shall see him as he is. Think about that. The same God who said, no, you can't look at me, you have to be put into the cleft of the rock, we'll be able to see him as he is. 2 Peter 1:4, by which he has granted to us precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. So your hope for one day in the future is that you will become a partaker of the divine nature. Again, that means how much more incredible can you get than you will become a partaker of the divine nature? So the nature of Christ in his divinity, we begin to take on some of that. That's what 2 Peter would tell us. So let's zoom out and kind of go through the whole thing one more time. All right, we'll make sure we're clear. So we're talking about what is man. Man fundamentally is created. He's a created being by a sovereign, spaceless, timeless, eternal creator. 2, he is fallen. Right? That the purposes for which man was created, he no longer fulfills rightly. 3, man can be redeemed in that we can be brought back, that man is not hopeless. There's an ability or a way that man can be brought back to God. And 4thly, that one day man will be made like God if he has turned to Christ and has put his faith in Christ. So, that's what man is. Again, I want to just read the C.S. Lewis quote again because I thought it was really helpful. Cease not to make mention of me before our common Lord, true God and only true man, for all we others since the fall of Adam are but half men. We have lost the purpose for which we are designed, but through Christ we can be made right with God. So, that's where we're in today, so let's pray. God, we thank you for your word. Thank you that you have explained to us, that you created us, you've taught us that we are not the act of kind of random processes, but that we were created by you, purposes for which we have fallen. We have all fallen short, all of us like sheep have gone astray. So we just pray that you would help us to live in Christ, the ultimate picture of humanity, the ultimate picture of what it means to be human, perfect fulfillment of that, and we look to him as his life, as the life we should have lived, and his death as a substitutionary death in our place, so that we could be redeemed, we could be made right with God. We pray that we just be conformed more and more into your image until the day that we're made like you. We pray this in Christ's name, for his sake. Amen.